Hello, everybody. This is going to be a quick overview and of Clay Are We Created by Isabel Allende. Um, it should follow the format of the other videos. There's a little bit of a different twist at the end in terms of the themes and things. I'm going to talk a little bit about them, but they're a little more open-ended this time. But some things to consider before we start reading the text. It is based on a real story, earthquake, avalanche, mudslide, and it was published in 1989. This is the most contemporary piece that we will read this semester. Silko's piece actually was written in the 70s. But I did want to throw Allende's piece in because it is more straightforwardly written, prose-wise, than Silko's piece is. First question to consider is the idea of magic realism. And it's not a question in the note sense, so I tend to ask it. Given the definition you see below, what is the take on how that definition plays out in the piece? I've seen some very interesting discussions going on, critical articles, and just in general, that this may not be magical realism, that some people have pushed a little further about the use of media becoming that magic or in place of that magic. And follow up to that, if we're looking at realism, and magic realism is supposed to be a realistic setting with something fantastic happening in it, how realistic is the reaction to the event that you've read? And you can think about that from a couple of different perspectives, not the least of which is the three characters we have that are named. And the narrator isn't named, but it's mentioned in the introductory materials that Eva Luna is the character's name from Allende's novel, Rolf, Carlet, and Azucena. How realistic is this, given the reaction we see? Excuse me. The plot is relatively straightforward, and because of that, its nature, there's not a lot of action for the protagonists, and I put the S on there because I'm always interested in the discussion, who is the main protagonist here? We've got Rolf, we've got Azucena, we've got Eva Luna, and they all have different sort of positions in this. Two of them are in the place that is described in the main setting, whereas the narrator of the piece is watching on TV many miles away, even with her own description. But she's also the one that's giving us all of the information that we get, and there is an emotional reaction to what she sees. Rolf probably has the most emotional reaction and takes the most action, whereas Azucena is in the central part of the story as things are happening to her. And so it's a question that I tend to throw out in stories like this when I've taught them, that, hey, who is the actual protagonist? So again, the thing about these responses ideas, if you choose to write on this piece, you're more than welcome. But the description at the beginning is relatively quick, and the phrase that jumped out at me is the little girl obstinately clinging to a life became the symbol of the tragedy. This text deals a lot with media, it deals a lot with how things are perceived, and so that jumped out at me. It's also sort of the bell ringing element for that's what everybody else thinks. What do you think? And I think it's a signal to the reader to consider what she represents to this particular text. The frequency of coverage that I mentioned in the notes is the media coverage, how often they come. They come so often that at one point she just, Azucena does not answer the reports because it's the same questions over and over again. Rolf himself is going over there as a reporter to cover the event. The statistics that pop up give a scope of how bad it is and why there's so much interest in it. I mean, 20,000 people, I believe, are buried in the mud. And that's why he's there, as I mentioned. And so that scope of national attention is problematic in terms of the amount of coverage it gets, only because it's like that is so big, that's how it happens. And you have to remember this is also 30 years ago, where phones and the like aren't there. And so this massive media presence is going to seem even more surprising to a reader, is my guess. Oh, I misspelled that. You can all... Thought I fixed that. So the question then becomes like, all right, if the media is swarming around these people and they're in this very intense situation, what do we make of the character? Because Rolf and Azucena are the ones who are taking the brunt of that, and sort of serving as that bridge for the audience, bridge for the narrator. What can we learn about these characters watching? And then we have to take that step back and realize that what we are seeing is all Ava Luna's sight as it comes through a lens, a radio report, news reports, even Rolf's camera at the beginning when he snaps those photos. And what points of progression build that up? When there is a move, a shift, we have the very clearly delineated sections that are days in there. You've got those little extra spaces that immediately begin with, hey, this is the first day, this is the second day, this is the third day. Are there other points of progression, character-wise, thematic-wise? Where do you see those shifts happening? On one of those points, I tend to highlight as many more hours would go by before he accepted that time had stagnated and reality had been irreparably distorted. The idea that Rolf himself doesn't know what time is, what time it is, or where, or what the real world is. And I think this is one of the lines that people pointed to as magic realism. But it also indicates a progression in Rolf's character as he's trying to make sense of the world around him, and it's not working really well. There are things in this cave, in this mud, that Rolf has to deal with. The narrator calls it a long night. We get a really distinct description. The amount of detail in this story is something worth noting. If you think about the lack of action, lack of movement, especially kinetic ideas in terms of Azucena just being stuck in the mud, it's basically just a picture with some movement happening around the centerpiece. There's a lot of different looks at it. She's sitting in a room, she goes to national television, so she's got different cameras, she's got different ideas, she's hearing different things. Azucena begins not answering, as I mentioned before, so that time passing, it's not a visual progression of time. And I think that becomes very important as you're watching this, because it's really difficult for someone who is not close to that scene to understand that. And so the plot mirrors how an audience might react to this situation without knowing somebody on the inside. The narrator has some inkling about what's going on because she knows that Rolf so well. She knows those emotions. She's watching him essentially break under pressure. Then that next line is that indication. It was impossible for Rolf to flee from himself any longer, and the visceral terror he lived as a boy suddenly invaded him. Those moments, and there are a lot of things that I didn't quite talk about for this reason, because I'm curious as to other people's ideas on it. I talked about the role of media, but the idea of tragedy, the purpose of tragedy, and you could talk about that, life in general, as it's portrayed in this piece, or you could talk about its role in literature as a rhetorical moment. They use this idea, well, I guess I should say, Allende uses this idea to sort of glue all of it together. But she also highlights it, and so pushes that out and saying to the reader, saying, hey, look, this is tragedy. We all know what happens in a tragedy, right? And then we get the role of government, because I do think this text takes a lot of shots at government. Some of them are more subtle, some of them are overt. Rather than talk about them, I want you guys to talk about them, those responses. Allende doesn't shy away from the story stance on some of them. And again, I think I mentioned the role of government as one. I'm going to list these in the prompts for that response assignment, but these are good places to start. This is a works cited page, and I'm throwing this up here with a quick reminder. If you open the PowerPoint, this is not indented properly because it won't let me do a hanging indent. This is a good template to use when creating your own works cited page. You might have to replace, obviously, the author and the title, the volume, the translator if there is one, and please the page numbers. But you can use that as a base for that for your essay. This is a pretty complicated story, and so I'm very interested to see what you guys have to say about it. Obviously, you don't have to respond to these in the prompt. You're more than welcome to. Some people might find it, they might find Silco more productive. But regardless, I hope it helped.